Chapter 9, Lyelin 9.1, April 3rd, 1431 AD. His love had bid him walk into the shadow of the mountain, to scale it until he could climb no higher, and then to remain there. So there he had remained. Hemhut stood alone atop the snowy mountain as he had for centuries, his body now completely encased in ice. The climate had changed since his love had last bid him farewell. Things had become different the world over, and the snow cap that had for decades and decades formed around him annually and then melted annually no longer melted. Over the years, as the seasons had mixed, the ice had hardened and built up around him, completely enveloping him over time. He could still see some features through the crystalline fractals that had overtaken his eyes, but could discern little more than the distinction of light from shadow. He knew that he would have to make the best of the coming days, as his love had told him that she would be with him a mere matter of a few months when next they meet, and that they would have no time for comfort. She had told him that this coming incarnation would be her most important life yet, as the changes that they were destined to make would resound through the future in cataclysmic ways, once more completely altering it from its course. He did not enjoy killing. He rather disdained it, but he would do anything that she asked of him. He would gladly shed the blood of babes, should she aim him in their direction. He had learned his lesson. He knew what it meant to disobey her. All of this was his fault, the consequence of his inaction. If he'd always had this sense of absolute obedience and had just simply done as she had asked of him when she'd asked it of him all those many lifetimes ago, perhaps they would have still had a chance at happiness. But he didn't, so they didn't. She had forgiven him. His love had met his devotion in kind, but he never allowed himself to forget what he had cost them. He was condemned to be so long alone with the knowledge that he had set their paradise ablaze. An ocean of blood for her, she who had spent so long building that which he destroyed in moments. Let it rain from the heavens for her if it be her will. All of the centuries and then centuries more spent apart had only deepened his resolve to please her. So he waited and listened until finally he heard her voice again. The ice shattered, bursting out in a spout of shards in the direction of his forward movement, and crumbling behind him as the cavity he'd left in the frozen prison was caved in. Lyelin had come, and her giant was off to awaken her. All of the vessels of Lyelin lived charmed lives. It was destiny by design. She would tolerate no insult to them that could be circumvented, suffer them no wound that could be deflected. Were it not for the imminent arrival of the demon, she would have lived long and happily through them all. As it was, she could never remain very long. It was always watching, always searching for her and her giant. This is what they had been reduced to, a shadow of their former. The world of delights that had awaited them had been reshaped. There was now to be a world of only suffering. For the past is immutable and cannot be undone. The demon was coming. There was no stopping him. Lyelin had managed to push him back, to keep him from coming into being for thousands of years, but could not prevent the eventuality of his rise to power. The best thing that they could do was to prepare for his coming and establish an advantage over him. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Maria Valencia of Spain, daughter of a nobleman, the ninth coming of Lyelin, was beginning to see through the eyes of others as well as through her own. She was not altogether thrilled at first, as she suspected that she had been hexed and that this was the work of some evil spell. She was afraid to tell anyone, not even her sisters, for fear that they may assume that she was in league with Lucifer. It was a dark time, the wrong time to come into supernatural powers. People were frequently accused and tried for everything from an act of heresy to the practice of witchcraft. The trial of Joan of Arc had commenced only 6 weeks before, and she was to burn at the stake inside of another 8. This would be the year that Vlad II Dracul, the intended prince of Wallachia, would be inducted into the Order of the Dragon. His son, Vlad III the Impaler, would later terrorize the Transylvanian Saxons, going so far as to display the corpses of his enemies along the borders of his territory to inspire fear in the hearts of those who would oppose him. and would openly negate Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II by slaughtering his envoys and attacking the empire, earning him a marked place in history as both a hero and a villain. The 100 Years' War was nearing its end, after having needlessly cost the lives of so many, all in pursuit of placing an undeserving seat atop the highest throne, placing the heaviest crown on an thereafter unburdened head. It was a hard time to live for most, and an easy time to die. Maria had never had a hard time of anything, however. She had been pampered and primed her whole life. She was 10 years old and certainly not ready to die. She so desperately wanted to seek counsel with regard to her newfound sight, to be assuaged by the notion that she was not in fact seeing with the devil's eyes. But so fearful was she of attracting persecution that she told no one. She said simply that she did not feel well and retired to her chambers for the day. She could see the servants approaching in hopes of tending to her ails. She could see the cooks preparing her meals in hopes of her eating. While she took the food, she did not eat. While she thanked the servants, she turned them away. She was distraught. She was burdened with a guilty conscience, having herself concluded that it must be the devil's work at play, and she condemned herself for it. She tried to think of what it could have been that she'd done to deserve such punishment. No sin in recent memory could possibly have been deserving of such reciprocity. She could think of nothing. She was innocent. She cried herself to sleep that night, trying hard to focus on her own sight and not that of others. She found it was easier to do with her own eyes open, easier to stay in her own head. So she fell asleep that way, with her eyes open. It was all she could do to sleep at all. The next morning, she awoke to find her older sister Natalia at her bedside. The effect immediately took hold. It had not gone away in her sleep as she'd so eagerly prayed for. When she looked into her sister's eyes, she could see both her sister and herself. She was seeing through several eyes all at once. Not only that, but images were beginning to blur and smear as she began to see farther into the future. 1.5 seconds doesn't seem like a long time until you are living between two worlds, one in the present and the other even a negligible amount of time into the future. Then it throws one off balance. It makes one unsure of their step. She broke down crying as soon as she was awakened, fearful gasps breaking up her tremulous breathing. Natalia held her and asked her whatever was the matter, but little Maria was so afraid of being tried and tortured to death for what was happening that all she told her sister was that something strange was happening to her, but refused to elaborate. Natalia called for the doctor, who met with an even less vocal Maria. She insisted to the doctor that she was fine and that she must have simply had a bad dream, but continued to cry as she realized that she had just repeated the interaction in reality, having seen it in her mind's eye moments before. It seemed to her that her life was no longer under her command. It seemed that she was being led and was simply following the steps laid out for her. After much fuss, she requested to be left alone to nap and recover from her terrible nightmare. The doctor assured Natalia that she had no ailment that he could discern and bid Natalia to send for him again if needed, but that otherwise she would be all right. Natalia was still concerned, having consoled her sister after many a nightmare in days gone by. This was different. This was the result of no nightmare. Her sister was genuinely scared. After everyone else had disbanded, she remained outside of Maria's door. She listened through the crack in the doorway, listened to her sister's desperate prayers to rid herself of the devil inside of her. Natalia gasped and threw her hand up to cover her mouth. Maria had stopped praying. She had been so lost in her own head that she didn't realize until that moment that Natalia was listening. Then she squarely saw it through her sister's own eyes. Natalia had heard her and now did not know what to make of her sister. Maria began to hyperventilate as she watched through Natalia's eyes. She had run to fetch the doctor before his retreat. She told him frantically what she'd overheard through the doorway. The doctor hesitated. Then he told her to alert her father and to call for a priest of a higher order than himself. Maria was completely distraught. They were conspiring against her already. She didn't know what to say to them. If she told the truth, she would burn, but she was unaccustomed to telling lies. She had no idea what to do. She knew only that she did not want to be there. Before she'd even made up her mind, she saw herself getting up and going out the door, so she followed through on her vision. She surrendered to it. She allowed her vision of where she had gone in the second and a half to come to dictate where she would go in the next second and a half. She was running on pure instinct. It must be the devil. She could not in any other way reconcile what was happening to her. Following the trail set her in a part of the castle that she had seldom been to before, a part where she did not know the way. She simply continued on, trusting that whatever it was that was inside of her would not lead her to an early grave. She also tried to see through as many eyes as possible in her vicinity that she could, so as to aid in her escape, but it was exceedingly difficult to decipher their presence from their futures, and it was all very disorienting. She was in panic. She watched as the doctor and Natalia opened her door and discovered that she'd fled her chambers. She went from a fast walk to a run when the doctor ordered that she be found and brought to him. She would be burned at the stake or worse if they caught and tried her. She had done nothing wrong, but she had been overheard confessing to demonic possession. The only thing that she could do was to run. Run or die. Hannah Dunn 5, December 26, 2024 AD. Leroy Watkins owned a pharmacy. He had been out for 2 weeks due to a catastrophic motor vehicle accident and was temporarily bound to a wheelchair because of sustaining major injuries to his legs. The other driver was killed. He had been instructed to take at least 4 weeks off of work, but he talked the orthopedic surgeon into writing him a release form that would allow him to legally return to work after only 2 weeks, provided he does nothing laborious. He wasn't apt to do much in the way of labor anyway, but he had a lot of missed paperwork to catch up on, and he ended up staying late the night of September the 8th, 2020. The world was in the grip of the COVID-19 pandemic, and he would be damned if he wasn't going to do his part for the public good. After everyone had left and they'd closed down for the evening, relieved that he could finally take his surgical mask off, he went through file after file, signing off on that which required his approval and checking and reading the abundance of correspondences that he'd missed. He caught up on most of the little tedious tasks that went along with owning and operating a business, innumerable as they were for his pharmacy. When he decided that he'd had enough for the night and was ready to call it quits, just as he was gathering his stuff to leave, he heard a ruckus in the storefront. Someone else was there. He didn't hesitate to trigger the silent alarm from a button underneath his desk. It was probably a junkie looking for drugs. His office had a little window built into the door, and he rolled over in his wheelchair to try and get a look at what was happening in his pharmacy. He could not believe what he was seeing. It wasn't some drug-seeking lowlife. It was a crazy person with a can of gasoline, and he was going up and down the shelves in the aisles, dousing them with gas. Not only that, but he was talking to himself and laughing as he did it, pausing every here and there to dance in place or strike a pose or randomly spasm and flail around. Leroy couldn't believe it. Some lunatic was about to set fire to his business, and here he was stuck in the back office in a wheelchair. He couldn't say what was going through his mind at the time, save for several expletives. Everything he had was poured into those walls. The building had a sprinkler system built in, but the water damage would be just as bad as any fire damage, if not worse. He watched helplessly as the dancing pyromaniac lit a windproof lighter and held it up, with the flame above his head like he were at a concert. He said something indiscernible, and then he held it to one of the shelves he'd doused. It went up quickly, and he skipped down the aisle with gas can and lighter in hand, then turned around to admire his work. He laughed, and he yelled, and he swung his arms around angrily. Then the sprinklers came on, and the fire was put out. The crazy person did not like that one bit, and he started jumping up and down and yelling at the sprinklers. Then, from through the window, Leroy must have caught his eye. The sprinkler in his office hadn't come on. Maybe it was defective, or maybe it was connected to a separate sensor. He was beginning to wonder if he had really hit that silent alarm after all, because he wasn't hearing any sirens yet. Oh no, he saw him. The crazed arsonist made straight for his office and burst in, accusing Leroy of having defied God and that he was doing what he must, and then laughed as he started dumping gasoline all around the little office. It seemed he transitioned from anger to joy and back and made no stops between. According to him, the fire was holy. The fire was cleansing. "You," he'd said to Leroy angrily, "you must be cleansed." He blocked the door and would not allow Leroy to leave. Then he shoved him out of his wheelchair hard onto the floor, and Leroy yelled in pain. He then swiped all the papers Leroy had been working on from atop his desk, and they scattered around, making perfect kindling. After he'd finished and he was ready, he took off his shirt and he tied it to the sprinkler head that protruded from the ceiling, not willing to be outsmarted again. If the sprinkler went off in here, it would only make a big puddle. It wouldn't undo his work. Then, as if in a moment of clarity, he turned to look at Leroy and in a very calm voice asked him, "Are you ready?" Leroy was in a great deal of pain from having been knocked from his wheelchair to the floor, but he responded to the man. He said, "Stop, you crazy motherfucker!" The man looked off into space and again very calmly said to himself, "He is ready." Then he went to the bulletin board behind his desk and lit the fire. Leroy tried to crawl, using as much of himself as he could muster, but the crazy man returned to block his way, holding his back to the closed door. The wall opposite them, the one with the bulletin board and the bookshelves behind his desk, it went up in no time at all. The fire was creeping steadily toward them along the floor and the walls, and the room was beginning to fill with thick black smoke. The smoke descended from the ceiling in one large mass, like a billowing blanket falling slowly to the ground. The crazy person ducked down and got on his knees next to Leroy to avoid breathing in the smoke, and he covered his face with his hand. He looked Leroy, who was screaming for help, right in the eye, and said to him, You are ready." Then he grabbed the gas can, but before he could douse Leroy with the gas, as was his obvious intention, something took hold of him. As the crazy person was lifted by the back of the neck up into the air, his tiptoes dangling inches above the ground, Leroy saw that there were 2 more feet there that hadn't been there before, and that had miraculously appeared just behind the crazy person. Then he looked up and saw a black figure, blacker than the smoke even, standing there holding the arsonist's head up to the ceiling. As the crazed pyromaniac coughed and choked, the black form began to move closer to the fire, the helpless man dangling, partly concealed by the black haze. The whole wall was one giant blaze now. Leroy managed to hoist himself up high enough to reach the doorknob and was scooting himself backward out of the office as he watched Daniel hold the arsonist's body face first against the flaming wall. He only screamed for a few moments before his larynx became charred, and then Daniel just held him there, seemingly untouched by the flames himself, just held him there until he was more than dead, engulfed in flame. Then it dropped the body. Leroy very clearly saw what had happened next. Backlit by the wall of flame, the black spirit looked into a ball he held in his right hand. Then he yanked the crazy man's shirt from the sprinkler head in the office. Dirty water gushed from the sprinkler, and the fire was out shortly after. "That's when the police and the fire department showed up," he told Hannah. "I told them what had happened, but they looked at me like I was crazy. I know stories like this, stories about the Shadow Man, have been going around. So they investigated me for a while to make sure I wasn't trying to pull off some kind of insurance scam, blaming it on the dead man in what used to be my office and citing involvement of the Shadow Man. I kind of wish I hadn't told them anything for all the trouble it caused me, but I just told them the truth. That's what you're supposed to do, right?" "Right," Hannah said. Her note-taking was scant, considering that she had read his story online already, and he hadn't told her anything that wasn't detailed in the report. She scanned her question sheet for any questions that she might have remaining that were not answered in the subtext of his story as he went on. "You know," he said, "my grandma said she saw a ghost when she was a kid. She said she woke up in the middle of the night and it was just standing at the foot of her bed, just standing there. Kind of like how old boy was just standing there, holding that man in the fire. I always kind of believed her, but not really. Boy, I wish she was alive now so that I could tell her what I've seen." "So," she said, "you think that he is a ghost?" "Well, yeah," Leroy furrowed his eyebrows. "What else could it be?" She checked another question off her list and asked him, "You don't think that he could be a real living person, as in that he could be alive right now?" He leaned forward, suddenly deep in contemplation. "Are you telling me that you think that the Shadow Man is someone who is alive? Like he's the spirit of someone walking the earth right now?" "I'm not saying anything," she said. "I'm just asking a question." "You are, though," he said. "I can tell, Miss Dunn. I'm a former business owner. I've conducted a number of interviews myself, and I know how to read people. I could tell by your tone and your body language when you ask the question. You think you know something that no one else knows. So can I ask you the same question? Do you think he's a real living, breathing person?" "Yes," she said. Not only do I feel it in my bones that he's out there, but the sightings reported of him from outside the local area are few and far between and mostly unverifiable. I believe that none of them are viable. I've been cataloging every incident I can find that is derived from credible sources, and it became obvious right away that this is a local phenomenon. This is only happening here in Las Vegas. There have been a few reports from surrounding towns that seem credible, some as far as Bullhead City, but the vast majority take place within city limits. Not only do I believe that he's a living man, I believe that he lives here in the city with us. Leroy sat back in his chair, contemplating the possibilities. Then after a moment of silence, he said, "He's a ghost, though. Don't you think the more reasonable conclusion is that he's dead and buried somewhere in the city? What makes you think that a ghost is alive?" "I don't know," she said plainly. "I just feel it. Maybe it's just hope." Another contemplative pause later, and Leroy said, "Stories of the Shadow Man only really started surfacing in the past few years. Maybe he died just before all this started. That would make sense. If you really want to find out who he really is, I would start by looking at obituaries from around the time when he first started appearing. That's what I would do." She squirmed for a moment, a little uncomfortable in her seat. Then she said, "Yes, I have considered that. I hope that it isn't true. I hope that he is alive, and I hope that I find him one day." "Well, if you ever do find him, you'll have to let me know, but don't go broadcasting it," he said. "He's doing God's work. Don't you let them stop him." Not at all shaken, she simply stoically said, "I won't, don't worry." They both know who it was he was talking about. The government. At every stop along the way up the branches of government, there grows more and more removal of the concerns of the common man. Decisions regarding the welfare of an individual end up passing through so many heads along the chain of command that when a decision is made with serious implications, it stems from a person completely disconnected from the individual in question. With none advocating on their behalf, in many cases the need for care is misconstrued as the need for incarceration. They both knew damn well that if the Shadow Man's identity were made public, he would be whisked away into a system that would condemn him. After all, he served as judge, jury, and executioner of his victims when he was none of these things the way the government saw it. Hannah stared into space for a moment. Then Leroy Watkins broke the silence by saying, "You know, if you really want to find him, start with the magic novelty shops around town. I gotta figure that's where he got that crystal ball." She came out of her stare and clicked her pen, setting it to the page. "Mr. Watkins, what makes you think that's a crystal ball he carries?" "Well, the way he looks into it," he said. "He looked into it before he carried the man over to the fire, then he looked at it again and dropped him, and then again before he freed up the sprinkler in my office to do his job. Then he looked at it again before he disappeared. It seems to me like he was looking into the crystal ball to figure out what to do next, like he could see into the future or something." This was nothing Hannah hadn't considered before, but she was practical. She didn't believe in the power of premonition, being that it negated the notion of free will and the congruence of time. She'd written poems on the topic. So she hoped that maybe she would blow his mind a little when she said, "Wouldn't knowledge of the present be sufficient?" "I suppose it would." He got up from his chair with much grunting and heaving, placing his cane under his weight, and said, "Well, the building has been repaired, but if you want to see the location, we can go there. You're driving, though." He laughed and made his way over toward the door. There wasn't anything more to see, but Hannah could tell that the poor man was eager to get out of the house, so Hannah gathered up her bag and her voice recorder, helped him with his coat, and then they made their way to the pharmacy. It wasn't his anymore. He'd sold it after the incident and gone into early retirement. He'd have to be a little smarter with his money than he'd hoped he would have to be, but he was done working. If he hadn't been so eager to work himself to death, he could have avoided almost dying. That was enough of a sign for him. No amount of money ever bought a minute of time. It was time he enjoyed life, so he intended to. Hannah enjoyed his company and ran down the rest of her questions on the drive and then dropped him back off at his house and walked him inside. She went home that night and created a file with Leroy Watkins' name as the header. After making a few arbitrary notes, she started the process of painstakingly typing up a transcript of the interview, word for word. She was a pretty fair typist, but she still had to pause playback on her voice recorder frequently throughout the whole process. Near the top, before the transcription, she wrote underneath the header the words "crystal ball" with a question mark. She didn't even want to think about the possibility that her savior was dead. and she didn't like the thought of empowering the notion by typing the words, but she faithfully translated every spoken word into print. It was her very first interview. It had a special place in the history books. No one remembered who she interviewed second and third, but every school child could tell you that Leroy Watkins was the first person Hannah Dunn ever interviewed. His interview was almost as famous as her undocumented interview with Ana Hernandez. Almost. It didn't exactly impact history the way that her interview with Ana Hernandez would, but it was a first, and firsts are often celebrated, regardless of whether or not they are of any great significance. Still, it was the first step on a long road that would eventually lead her right to Daniel Dwyer's doorstep, and significance is in the eye of the beholder. To Leroy Watkins, it meant everything to him that he had lived, even if it meant very little to anyone else. It is easy to look in the history books and brush through the stories without much empathy, but they were real people, living real lives. All suffering is worth remembering. It is life's great teacher.